The room revealed itself in stages, like a photograph developing in its chemical bath. Whimsy moved with deliberate slowness, pausing occasionally to examine a volume on the shelves or to adjust the position of a paperweight, as though his actions were entirely casual, entirely unconnected to any investigative purpose. Yet Clarissa, watching from the doorway, found her breathing had become shallow and irregular. There was something profoundly unnerving about a man who could make the examination of a dead relative's study seem like a drawing-room entertainment. "Your brother-in-law was a meticulous person," Whimsy observed, running his fingers along a row of leather-bound volumes. "One can tell immediately from the arrangement of his library. Everything catalogued, cross-referenced, maintained with almost military precision. Such men do not, as a general rule, suffer from disorganization in their domestic affairs. Yet here we have a most curious inconsistency." He turned to face her directly. "The Colonel's personal correspondence is nowhere in evidence. I noticed several pigeonholes in the desk, all empty. A man of his evident temperament would maintain his correspondence, would he not? Bills, letters from solicitors, notes regarding estate matters, all of it gone. Or perhaps it was never here at all. I'm sure I cannot say," Clarissa replied, her fingers now working the small lace handkerchief she carried. "Stephen may have removed his papers after the discovery. He was the executor, you understand." "How very convenient," Whimsy murmured, and the words carried a weight that transformed them from casual observation into something considerably more pointed. He turned his attention to the fireplace, where ashes lay in the grate, not the accumulated debris of weeks, but the fresh residue of a recent burning. He knelt beside it with the grace of a man twice his age, regarding the blackened remnants with an intensity that suggested he was reading scripture. One wonders what the Colonel found so compelling that it required immediate incineration. Correspondence of a delicate nature, perhaps? Photographs that did not reflect well upon his character? Or something of considerably greater significance? Whimsy rose, brushing ash from his perfectly creased trouser leg with an expression of mild distaste, as though the very act of contact with such materials offended his sensibilities. "The question becomes not what was burned, Mrs. Clarissa, but when it was burned. The local constable, in his thorough examination of the scene following the Colonel's discovery, would surely have remarked upon a recently used fireplace. The fire was not lit on the evening of his death, was it? I observed no wood stacked beside the hearth, no arrangement suggesting recent use by the Colonel himself. That is to say, Clarissa's composure, which had maintained its surface integrity thus far, began to fracture along previously invisible seams. The servants may have tidied the room. After he was found, when they came to remove him, they may have— Servants, in my experience, are generally reluctant to disturb a room in which a death has occurred," Whimsy interrupted gently. "There is a superstition about such matters, you understand, a reluctance to seem presumptuous before the authorities have completed their examination. And I noticed something else rather illuminating." He gestured toward the desk's chair, which was positioned at a slight angle to the piece of furniture itself. "This chair does not suggest a man who settled himself for an evening of contemplative drinking. It is displaced from its natural position, as though someone had moved it subsequently, perhaps to position a body more convincingly upon it. The wear marks on the carpet do not align with its present location." At this, Clarissa made a small sound, something between a gasp and a suppressed sob. Whimsy regarded her with an expression of courteous sympathy that somehow managed to be more damning than open accusation. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere rather less funereal," he suggested. "The drawing-room, or even the garden, though I confess the weather does not favor it. There is a question or two I should like to pose, and I find that people respond more truthfully when not standing in the immediate presence of their own deception." "I don't understand what you're suggesting," Clarissa said, but her voice had lost its former steadiness. It wavered, uncertain, like a woman standing on ice that had begun to crack beneath her feet. "No," Whimsy agreed, moving toward the door with the casual grace of a man entirely satisfied with his afternoon's work. "But you shall, I think, before this matter is concluded. The human mind is a curious instrument, Mrs. Clarissa. It is capable of extraordinary feats of self-deception, particularly when weighted down by guilt and the desire to protect those we love. However, it possesses a fatal flaw. It cannot simultaneously maintain multiple contradictions. Eventually, one must abandon fiction for fact, or the entire structure collapses entirely. He paused at the threshold, turning back to regard the evening coat hook with an expression of abstract interest. "I should like to speak with your nephew at your earliest convenience. Stephen, I believe, is currently residing in the village? The Red Lion Hotel, if my information proves accurate. And perhaps, before we conclude our conversation, you might explain why the Colonel's outdoor coat should bear traces of having been recently laundered, when no laundress has visited this house inn." The past week, the silence that followed was eloquent with the weight of unspoken truths. The Red Lion Hotel occupied that peculiar niche in English provincial architecture reserved for establishments that had once possessed modest charm and had since surrendered to the encroachments of time and indifference. Its facade, painted a shade of brown that suggested neither deliberate choice nor active maintenance, faced the village high street with the resigned demeanor of a gentlewoman reduced to taking in lodgers. Whimsy crossed its threshold at precisely 4 o'clock, an hour calculated to find most residents either occupied with afternoon callers or engaged in the solitary pursuits that hotel life imposed upon its temporary denizens. The proprietor, a Mrs. Gantry, with the bearing of a woman who had survived 3 wars and 2 difficult marriages, informed him that Mr. Stephen Ashford was indeed in residence and could likely be found in the smoking room, where he had been sitting since luncheon with an expression suggesting he was contemplating either profound philosophy or his next whiskey. Stephen Ashford proved to be a man of perhaps 35 years, possessed of that particular form of handsomeness that derives from good breeding rather than any actual distinction of feature. His dark hair had begun its retreat from his forehead in a manner that suggested either premature aging or considerable anxiety, and his hands bore the tremor of a man who had recently discovered that alcohol provided temporary relief from thoughts he preferred not to examine too closely. He rose as Whimsy entered, with the courtesy of someone who had been raised to observe the forms even when his mind was elsewhere, and gestured toward the vacant chair across from him. "Lord Peter Whimsy," Stephen said, and there was relief in his voice, mingled with something that might have been dread. "I confess I half hoped the Home Office would take my letter seriously. You've come about my uncle, then? About the manner of his death? Your aunt suggests that your grief has inclined you toward imaginative reconstructions of perfectly ordinary events," Whimsy replied, settling himself into the chair with the ease of a man assuming possession of his own drawing-room. "She used the phrase dramatics, I believe, though I find the term rather reductive when applied to the concerns of a man sufficiently convinced of foul play that he engaged the resources of government. Most people, I find, are rather reluctant to appear foolish before the authorities. It suggests a degree of conviction that mere fancy would scarcely justify." Stephen's fingers tightened around his whiskey glass. "Aunt Clarissa would say that. She always maintained that Uncle Edmund's death was a simple matter of a weak heart giving way. But I knew my uncle, Lord Peter. I knew him far better than she did, for all her years of managing his household. He was not a man given to sudden collapse. He was methodical, careful, almost obsessively concerned with his health. He maintained a detailed journal of his activities, his meals, his medical symptoms. Such a man does not simply expire without warning. And yet men do expire," Whimsy observed, reaching into his waistcoat for a cigarette case of considerable elegance. "Even methodical men, even careful men. The heart, for all its poetic associations, is merely a muscular organ, subject to the same mechanical failures that plague any mechanical device. However, your concern suggests something more specific than mere anxiety regarding an elderly relative's mortality. What precisely troubled you about the circumstances of discovery?" Stephen took a long pull from his whiskey before responding. "I wasn't present when they found him. I was in London on business, cons, ulting work with an insurance firm, rather dull stuff. But when I returned, when I saw the room where he died, something seemed wrong. I couldn't articulate it precisely, but the arrangement seemed staged somehow. Uncle Edmund was found slumped in his chair, an empty brandy glass beside him, as though he had simply dozed off and never woken. But it was so perfectly arranged, you understand, so perfectly theatrical, as though someone had positioned him there deliberately. Curious observation, Whimsy murmured, lighting his cigarette with deliberate care. Most people lack the theatrical sensibility to recognize staging when confronted with it. They accept the presented scene without question, content with the most obvious interpretation. What precisely suggested artifice to you? The position of his body, Stephen said, leaning forward with the intensity of a man finally able to articulate thoughts that had been festering in his mind for days. His head was tilted back against the chair, his arms draped symmetrically across the armrests. It seemed too composed, too perfect. When my father died, years ago, I remember how his body had been found, twisted at an awkward angle, one arm flung out, the other trapped beneath him. Death, I discovered, is rarely neat, it is rarely posed. Yet my uncle appeared to have arranged himself with the precision of a man sitting for a portrait. Whimsy regarded him through the haze of cigarette smoke with an expression of mild interest that gave nothing away. You mentioned that your uncle maintained a detailed journal. I presume this document has been examined by the local authorities. Stephen's hesitation stretched just long enough to become significant. The journal was not present when the police conducted their initial examination. I discovered its absence when I arrived to sort through his effects. I asked Aunt Clarissa about it, but she claimed ignorance. She suggested that Uncle Edmund might have destroyed it himself, or that it had been lost in the confusion following his death. But Uncle Edmund never lost anything. His entire life was organized around the principle that disorder led to error, and error led to consequences. How very orderly of him, Whimsy observed dryly. And yet someone has managed to create considerable disorder from that orderly existence. Tell me, Mr. Stephen, during your residence at Ashford Manor prior to your uncle's death, did you notice anything unusual in his demeanor? Any indication of anxiety, estrangement, or unusual correspondence? He seemed troubled, Stephen admitted, more troubled than I had seen him in years. He spent increasingly lengthy periods in his study, with the door locked. There were several visitors, people I did not recognize, who came to see him at odd hours. Aunt Clarissa seemed unusually anxious during these visits, and once I heard raised voices from behind the study door, though I could not distinguish words. Whimsy leaned back in his chair, exhaling smoke toward the ceiling with the air of a man whose suspicions had just acquired substance and shape. I begin to perceive the outline of a most interesting problem, Mr. Stephen, one that involves not merely the death of your uncle, but a conspiracy of silence maintained by those closest to him. The question becomes not whether your uncle was murdered, but rather who among his intimate circle possessed both the motive and the opportunity to accomplish it. And I confess, at this juncture, I find myself quite unable to determine which of those two matters presents the greater mystery. Whimsy departed the Red Lion with considerably more information than he had arrived with, though the knowledge served primarily to deepen rather than resolve the various mysteries that had begun to accumulate around Colonel Edmund Ashford's unexpectedly terminal heart failure. The November afternoon had taken on that peculiar quality of fading light that characterized English autumns, the sun descending toward the horizon with the reluctance of a guest departing an unsatisfactory dinner party. He took a circuitous route back to the manor, choosing instead to explore the village itself, making observations of the sort that would have seemed entirely random to anyone observing him, but which in fact represented the methodical cataloguing of a mind accustomed to extracting significance from trivia. The local chemist's shop, he noted, was operated by a man named Hartley, with the precise manner of someone trained in exact measurements and the consequences of error. Upon casual inquiry regarding the sort of prescriptions the colonel had recently obtained, Mr. Hartley became remarkably forthcoming, a tendency that Whimsy had long since observed in provincial chemists, who regarded their professional discretion as somewhat less binding than their desire to appear knowledgeable and important. The colonel, it transpired, had been obtaining increasingly large quantities of a particular tonic, the sort marketed to gentlemen of advancing years as a restorative for flagging vitality. Nothing sinister, nothing that would raise eyebrows, and yet the quantities had tripled in the 3 months prior to his death. Whimsy filed this information alongside his previous observations, sensing the faint outline of a pattern that had not yet achieved sufficient clarity to be truly visible. He arrived at Ashford Manor as dusk was settling over the grounds, transforming the Gothic turrets into silhouettes that seemed rather less ridiculous in shadow than they had in daylight. Bunter, who had been left to his own devices in the servants' quarters, greeted his return with that particular blend of solicit, eude, and subtle disapproval that characterized the valet's response to his employer's investigative perambulations. Dinner was, it seemed, approaching, and certain standards regarding punctuality and sartorial presentation would require maintenance. It was during the evening meal that Whimsy observed something of considerable interest. Mrs. Clarissa presided over the dining table with the rigid propriety of a woman determined that normal social conventions would proceed uninterrupted by trifles such as murder investigations. Yet her consumption of food was negligible, her attention constantly drawn toward the window that overlooked the garden, as though she anticipated some visitor or event that had not yet materialized. The servants moved about the room with the careful silence of individuals who sensed the presence of something fractured beneath the surface of civility. And once, when a servant inadvertently allowed a dish to rattle slightly, Clarissa's hand trembled noticeably as she reached for her wine-glass. After dinner, when Whimsy had been settled in the library with coffee and a brandy that was considerably superior to the glass that had allegedly accompanied the colonel to his eternal rest, he requested a word with the household staff. Mrs. Clarissa, clearly uncomfortable with this proposal, attempted to dissuade him, suggesting that such matters were best left to the police. However, Whimsy deployed that particular smile which indicated that his request, while phrased in courteous terminology, was in fact non-negotiable. Presently, he found himself in the servants' hall, regarding a collection of individuals whose expressions ranged from curiosity to active hostility. The butler, a man named Graves with the bearing of someone who had served in military capacity and had never quite relinquished the habit of command, proved to be the most cooperative. He acknowledged, when pressed, that the colonel's final day had contained certain irregularities. The Morning Post had brought a letter that had visibly agitated the colonel. He had remained in his study for the remainder of the day, allowing no one to disturb him save for Mrs. Clarissa, who had visited him twice. The first visit had been brief and cordial. The second, occurring in the late afternoon, had been marked by considerable discussion, the muffled sound of which had carried through the study door. Did Mrs. Clarissa appear distressed when she emerged from this second visit? Whimsy inquired. Graves hesitated, clearly wrestling with the competing demands of discretion and honesty. She appeared, sir, as though she had been crying, though she made an effort to conceal it. She went directly to her room and did not emerge until dinner was served. And the colonel's appearance when he finally left the study? I did not observe him leaving the study, sir, Graves replied. He did not emerge for dinner. Mrs. Clarissa said he had requested a tray to be sent to him, along with a bottle of the colonel's preferred brandy. I prepared the tray myself and left it outside the study door at 7:30, as instructed. Whimsy set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. Who discovered the body precisely? The housemaid Margaret, sir. She came to collect the dinner tray the following morning and found him as described. The glass was empty, the plate untouched. She raised the alarm immediately. And where precisely was Mrs. Clarissa when this discovery was made? Another hesitation, this one weighted with the significance of information that had not previously been volunteered to the authorities. In the garden, sir. She had risen early and was taking her constitutional walk. She did not return to the house until Margaret came running with her news. Whimsy rose from his chair with the grace of a man whose suspicions had just acquired the solidity of established fact. I believe I shall retire early this evening, Mr. Graves. However, I should be grateful if you would ensure that the study remains undisturbed. I may wish to examine it further tomorrow in natural light. And should Mrs. Clarissa inquire regarding the substance of our conversation, You may inform her that I was merely collecting routine information regarding the household's daily habits." The butler, clearly aware that he had just participated in something of considerable importance, inclined his head with the formality of a man acknowledging a superior officer. Yet his eyes betrayed considerable anxiety regarding the implications of what he had just inadvertently revealed. The night at Ashford Manor proceeded with the particular quality of silence that attends country houses where secrets have begun their inevitable process of emergence into daylight. Whimsy, contrary to his stated intention, did not retire early, but instead spent several hours in the library examining Colonel Ashford's collection of volumes, a task that proved illuminating in ways that had nothing to do with the ostensible subject matter. The colonel had possessed an extraordinary collection of works on toxicology, pharmacology, and the effects of various botanical substances upon the human organism. These were not the idle curiosities of a dilettante, but rather the focused acquisitions of a man pursuing a specific line of inquiry with methodical determination. Several passages had been marked with precision, particular attention paid to discussions of slow poisoning, the detection of various toxins in post-mortem examination, and the methods by which poisoning might be disguised as natural causes. Whimsy photographed these passages mentally with the thoroughness of a man who had long since ceased to err. Ellie upon the fallibility of written notes. By midnight, when the house had settled into that profound quietude characteristic of sleeping country estates, Whimsy made his way to the study. The evening coat still hung upon its hook, and he examined it now with considerably greater attention than time had previously permitted. The damp quality that had initially caught his notice had largely dissipated, but the collar bore faint traces of what appeared to be soap residue. Expensive soap, the sort one obtained from London rather than from the village chemist. The coat had not merely been laundered, it had been recently and thoroughly cleaned, presumably to remove evidence of something. Whimsy held the garment to his nose and detected, beneath the soap, a faint chemical odor that his experienced senses identified with unsettling certainty. Bitter almonds. The scent was nearly imperceptible, but it was present nonetheless, suggesting that someone had made a considerable effort to remove traces of a substance that should not, ideally, have contaminated the colonel's outdoor wear in the first place. He turned his attention to the fireplace, where the ashes still lay undisturbed. Using a small implement drawn from his waistcoat, he carefully sifted through the blackened remnants, extracting several fragments of paper that had escaped complete incineration. The writing upon them was faint but legible, portions of letters, fragments of phrases that suggested correspondence of an intimate nature. "Cannot continue this deception," one fragment read. Another contained only the phrase "the inheritance must not," trailing off into illegibility. A third, more intriguing still, bore what appeared to be a name, Meredith, followed by a date from approximately 15 years prior. Whimsy straightened, positioning the fragments carefully upon the desk's surface where he could examine them in proper light. The picture that was beginning to coalesce possessed all the elements of classical tragedy, concealment, desperation, the collision between present circumstance and past transgression. Yet it lacked, as yet, the final piece that would transform suspicion into certainty. He required access to the colonel's personal papers, the correspondence that had been so carefully removed from the study, and he required, most particularly, an understanding of the relationship between Colonel Edmund Ashford and the mysterious visitor who had agitated him so considerably in the days preceding his death. It was at this precise moment, as though summoned by the concentration of Whimsy's thoughts, that a sound disturbed the study's solitude, not the sound of footsteps, but rather the faint creak of a floorboard in the corridor beyond, a sound that suggested movement, hesitation, the careful progress of someone attempting to proceed undetected. Whimsy extinguished the small electric torch he had been using and positioned himself behind the study door, in the shadows where observation was possible without being observed. The door opened with agonizing slowness, and a figure entered, Mrs. Clarissa, dressed in a heavy dressing gown, her face ghostly in the faint moonlight that penetrated the windows. She moved directly to the fireplace, her eyes fixed upon the ashes as though they held answers to questions she dared not voice aloud. Her hands shook as she knelt beside the hearth, beginning to collect the fragments that Whimsy had so carefully arranged. She worked with the desperate urgency of a woman attempting to erase evidence that her mind had allowed her to believe safely destroyed. Yet as she reached for the fragments, her hand froze. She had perceived, with the heightened sensitivity of guilt, that the ashes had been disturbed. The arrangement was wrong. The airful chaos of incinerated paper no longer possessed the accidental randomness of material consumed by fire hours previously. Whimsy stepped from the shadows with the casual grace of a man who had merely been waiting for the appropriate dramatic moment to reveal himself. Clarissa started backward, her hand pressed to her mouth, her face draining of all color. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of the truth that was now finally undeniable. "I should have burned everything," Clarissa whispered, her voice barely audible. "I should have ensured that every trace was destroyed. But I was weak, and I thought that if I simply did not see it, did not acknowledge it, that perhaps it might somehow resolve itself into something bearable. How foolish I was, how utterly, completely foolish." "Not foolish," Whimsy corrected gently. "Frightened. There is a distinction, though I confess the outcome in either case tends toward the same unfortunate conclusion. Now, Mrs. Clarissa, I believe we should have a conversation regarding your brother-in-law's death, and the particular circumstances that made it seem, to your mind at least, a necessary occurrence." They settled themselves in the library, where Whimsy dispensed brandy with the solemnity of a man administering sacrament. Clarissa held the glass without drinking, her fingers wrapped around it as though seeking warmth rather than intoxication. The clock on the mantelpiece indicated 3 o'clock in the morning, that peculiar hour when the barriers between night and day dissolve into a sort of temporal purgatory, where truth seems both more terrible and more inevitable than it would in daylight. Whimsy positioned himself across from her, his expression one of attentive sympathy, laced with the implacable patience of a man who understood that confession, once begun, requires only the proper silence to continue. "You must understand," Clarissa began, her voice emerging in fragments, like pieces of a shattered vessel being reassembled by trembling hands, "that Edmund was not always the man you have seen. Or rather, he was always that man. But there was another Edmund beneath the surface, buried so deeply that even I did not fully comprehend it until the letter arrived. The letter that changed everything." She paused, drawing a breath as though gathering courage for the exposition to follow. "Edmund married my sister, Catherine, 42 years ago. It was a suitable match, respectable in all particulars. We were all younger then, less aware of the complications that life arranges for those foolish enough to believe in the permanence of their own arrangements." Whimsy remained silent, understanding instinctively that the most effective interviewing technique involved the strategic deployment of inaction. Clarissa required space for her narrative to unfold, and any intervention, however gentle, would likely result in the narrative fragmenting into defensiveness and evasion. 3 years after their marriage, Clarissa continued, Edmund developed an attachment to a young woman named Meredith Colborne. She was the daughter of one of Edmund's business associates, vivacious, accomplished, entirely unsuitable for a man of his station. Catherine discovered the affair naturally. Women always do. We possess a terrible intuition regarding such matters. But rather than demanding a divorce or creating a scandal, Catherine did something far more terrible. She accepted it. She permitted Edmund to maintain his second family, his second household, his second life, provided that appearance was maintained, and her position as his wife was never publicly questioned. It was, I suppose, a pragmatic arrangement, the sort that permits the wealthy to manage their transgressy. Ons, with discretion. She took a small sip of brandy, though the action seemed almost involuntary. Meredith bore Edmund a child, a daughter. The girl was raised in London, educated privately, kept entirely separate from our world. Edmund visited regularly, maintained both his families with the precision he brought to all other matters. And Catherine, my poor sister, lived out her remaining years in a state of dignified torment, never acknowledging, never confronting, simply enduring. Clarissa's voice had become barely audible. When Catherine died 15 years ago, I believed the arrangement would finally end, but Edmund merely transferred his divided loyalty. He continued to support Meredith and the daughter, now grown to womanhood herself, while maintaining the fiction that they had no connection to him whatsoever. "And the daughter?" Whimsy inquired softly. "What became of her?" "She married poorly," Clarissa said, with the particular bitterness reserved for those who have witnessed others make catastrophic choices. A man of no prospects, no character, no restraint. He died 3 years ago. Drink and dissolution, the sort of death that comes to those who lack the discipline to manage their own destruction. The daughter was left with debts, considerable debts, and no means of addressing them. She wrote to Edmund, demanding that he acknowledge her publicly, that he provide the financial settlement she believed her legitimacy entitled her to claim. She threatened, if he refused, to create a scandal that would expose his entire double life. Whimsy leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing with the intensity of a man perceiving the final pieces of a puzzle achieving alignment. "When did this demand arrive?" 6 weeks before his death, Clarissa replied. The letter came directly to him, marked with her maiden name so that no one examining the post would understand its significance. But Edmund understood. He became consumed with anxiety, with the fear that decades of carefully constructed deception were about to collapse into public humiliation. He spent hours in his study, attempting to calculate how much a settlement would require, how he might provide it without drawing attention to its purpose. He was terrified, Lord Peter. I had never seen Edmund frightened before, and the sight of it was more disturbing than any amount of anger or outrage would have been. "And you," Whimsy said gently, "you became frightened as well. Not for Edmund's reputation, but for something more immediate. His will, perhaps. The disposition of his estate." Clarissa's face crumpled like paper subjected to flame. "My own circumstances are modest. My marriage was brief and childless. I have lived here as Edmund's dependent for 25 years, ever since my sister's death. When Edmund died, I believed I would have security, a modest annuity, the ability to maintain my position. But if he acknowledged this daughter, if he settled a considerable sum upon her, my inheritance would be compromised. My future would be rendered uncertain. And I was terrified, Lord Peter. I was terrified of becoming a woman of no resources in a world that has no kindness for such creatures." "So you murdered him," Whimsy stated, the words neither question nor accusation, but simple, factual observation. The silence that followed was confirmation more eloquent than any confession could have achieved. "How did you obtain it?" Whimsy asked, his voice carrying neither judgment nor surprise, merely the clinical curiosity of a man interested in the mechanics of a problem. "The poison, I mean. Cyanide is not a substance that presents itself readily to gentlewomen of limited resources and even more limited access to chemical suppliers. The bitter almond scent that clung to your broth. Her in-law's coat suggests a compound of considerable potency, the sort that requires either professional knowledge or access to industrial sources." Clarissa's hands trembled as she set down her untouched brandy. "There was a gardener, years ago, before the present man. He used cyanide to control the rat population in the cellars. When he left his position, I discovered that he had left behind several bottles of the compound, stored in the garden shed beneath loose floorboards. I have lived here for so long, Lord Peter, that I know every secret the house possesses, every hidden corner, every forgotten storage space, every item that has been misplaced and abandoned through decades of accumulated household management. I found the bottles when I was searching for something entirely unrelated, and I kept them. Why, I cannot precisely say. Perhaps some instinctive understanding that a woman alone requires methods of protection, however terrible. Or perhaps, and this is far more disturbing, perhaps some part of me knew even then that I might someday require such a solution." She rose from her chair and moved to the window, gazing out into the darkness beyond as though seeking absolution in the landscape. "I decided upon the evening he received the letter from his daughter. I had not planned it previously. There was no moment of conscious determination, no careful calculation leading to premeditation. It was rather more organic than that, more inevitable, I simply looked at my future and perceived only diminishment, irrelevance, and want. And I perceived an alternative that seemed, in that moment of desperation, to be the only rational response available to me. The tonic, Whimsy observed, the quantities of which the chemist informed me had tripled in the months preceding his death. You were accustoming him to the taste of something, weren't you? Some vehicle through which the poison could be introduced without provoking suspicion regarding the bitterness that even careful disguise cannot entirely conceal. A compound of his own design, ironically, Clarissa replied with a bitter smile. He had become increasingly concerned with his heart, with the possibility that his own circulatory system might betray him. He had concocted a tonic from various ingredients, brandy, honey, certain herbs and extracts, which he believed fortified his constitution. He took it religiously each evening before retiring. I merely ensured that the final dose contained something more substantial than mere herbal extract. And the letter from his daughter? Whimsy asked. The correspondence that you were so carefully attempting to burn when I intercepted you. I removed it from his study immediately after his death, Clarissa explained. I knew that if the authorities discovered it, they would begin making inquiries, would eventually learn about Meredith and the daughter, would begin to perceive the pattern of concealment and deception that had characterized his life. By destroying the letter, I hoped to present a death that appeared entirely natural, the simple expiration of an aging man whose heart had finally surrendered beneath the weight of accumulated years. Whimsy rose from his chair and moved to the window beside her, regarding the dark landscape with the detached interest of a man contemplating abstract philosophy rather than the consequences of deliberate murder. You were reasonably thorough in your planning, I must acknowledge. The timing was fortuitous, your constitutional walk in the garden, which meant you were absent when the body was discovered. The destruction of his correspondence removed the most obvious motive for investigation. The laundering of your own clothing ensured that no trace of the poison would contaminate your person. And the evening coat, hung upon its hook where it would eventually be discovered, but not immediately questioned, served as a sufficiently subtle hint of preparation for departure that might have satisfied even the most cursory examination of the scene. And yet you perceived it all, Clarissa said quietly. You, a stranger, arrived at the house with no prior knowledge, and within a matter of hours you had identified the inconsistencies that the local authorities had entirely failed to notice. How is such perception possible? How can a man trained in the conventional methods of investigation look at a room and perceive the truth that others have overlooked? It is a matter of attention, Whimsy replied with characteristic modesty. Most people observe without truly seeing. They accept the surface of things, the arrangement presented to them, the narrative that appears most obvious. But murder, Mrs. Clarissa, is fundamentally a problem of narrative. The murderer must construct a story that convinces others to accept a particular version of events. They must ensure that all the details align, that nothing protrudes so obviously as to demand explanation. Yet inevitably, something remains unconsidered. The evening coat, in this instance, an object so ordinary that it should not have warranted attention, yet so carelessly placed that its very ordinariness became suspicious. You were conscientious in your planning, but you could not account for the possibility that someone would examine your work with sufficient rigor to perceive the flaw. He turned to face her directly, and his expression, while not unkind, possessed the terrible clarity of a man who perceived her not as a sympathetic figure reduced to murder by circumstance, but as someone who had made a deliberate choice to preserve her own comfort at the expense of another's life. I must now inform you that this conversation, has reached a point at which silence becomes complicity, and my role as a private investigator yields to my obligation as a citizen. Inspector Thorpe will require to be informed of these developments. The local constabulary, despite their previous inadequacies, will need to conduct a proper investigation. And you, Mrs. Clarissa, will require to prepare yourself for the consequences of your actions. Clarissa nodded, as though she had anticipated this moment from the beginning, as though some part of her had known that confession, once begun, could only conclude in one fashion. The dawn broke over Ashford Manor with the grey reluctance characteristic of November mornings, as though the sun itself harboured reservations regarding the day's proceedings. Whimsy, having allowed Clarissa to retire to her chambers under the discreet observation of Bunter, a man whose discretion extended to such delicate matters, had spent the intervening hours composing a detailed account of his findings, presented with the methodical precision that transformed suspicion into documented fact. Inspector Thorpe arrived shortly after breakfast, accompanied by a constable whose primary qualifications appeared to consist of the ability to take copious notes while understanding very little of what was being transcribed. The morning proceeded with the ceremonial inevitability of legal process. Clarissa was questioned formally, her confession recorded with the sort of bureaucratic solemnity that transformed emotional turmoil into administrative documentation. A constable was dispatched to the garden shed where the remaining bottles of cyanide compound were discovered precisely where Clarissa had described them, their labels faded but their contents sufficiently intact to confirm the poison's identity through chemical analysis. The Colonel's study was examined with considerably greater rigor than had been applied to it on the morning following his death, and various items of circumstantial evidence were catalogued and preserved for potential presentation to a magistrate. Yet there remained, in Whimsy's perception, a certain incompleteness to the proceedings. The confession was genuine, the evidence convincing, and Clarissa's guilt as established as such matters could be established within the constraints of English law. And yet the case possessed the peculiar quality of a symphony that had concluded while certain instrumental voices remained unresolved. It was this sense of incompleteness that prompted Whimsy to request, before his departure, a final private conversation with Mrs. Clarissa. She received him in the morning room, dressed now in the formal black of mourning, a garment change that Whimsy perceived as something akin to a final costume assumption, the concluding performance of a woman who had lived so much of her life performing the role expected of her. Her manner had altered dramatically. The anxiety that had characterized their previous interactions had been replaced by something resembling resignation, as though the act of confession had drained from her the capacity for further pretense. "I have been thinking," Whimsy began, settling himself into the chair she indicated, "about the question of motive, which is to say, about the distinction between the reason one commits a crime and the justification one constructs to make that crime bearable to one's own conscience. You presented your actions as motivated primarily by financial anxiety, the fear of diminished circumstances, the prospect of reduced security in your advancing years, and doubtless that element was present. Financial desperation is a perfectly adequate motive for murder, and the authorities will find in your confession precisely what they require to close their investigation and congratulate themselves upon their thoroughness." Clarissa's fingers moved to the silver pendant she wore at her throat, a nervous gesture that suggested Whimsy's observation had struck more precisely than was entirely comfortable. "I do not perceive any necessity for elaboration upon my confession," she said carefully. "I have admitted to the crime, I have indicated my means and my opportunity. The motive is sufficiently documented through my own testimony regarding the Colonel's intended recognition of his illegitimate daughter. And yet," Whimsy continued, his tone carrying that particular note of ironic amusement that suggested he perceived something considerably more complex than Clarissa's straightforward account, had acknowledged, "I find myself troubled by certain details that do not align with the narrative you have presented. The poison was obtained weeks, possibly months, before the Colonel's receipt of the letter from his daughter. You kept those bottles. You maintained them in the garden shed, and you claimed that you did not know precisely why you retained them. But I wonder whether that is entirely accurate. I wonder whether the impulse to retain them was not simply the hoarding instinct of a woman without resources, but rather represented something far more deliberate. I wonder whether you have been contemplating this action for considerably longer than you have acknowledged." Clarissa's composure fractured, though only marginally. A slight tremor affected her hands, and her eyes, previously fixed upon some point beyond the windows, turned toward Whimsy with an expression of something approaching desperation. "What does it matter?" she asked quietly. The result is the same regardless of whether I planned this for weeks or years. Edmund is dead, and I am to be prosecuted for his murder. The precise nature of my premeditation seems to me a matter of secondary significance. On the contrary, Whimsy replied gently, it is of considerable significance, though perhaps not in the manner you anticipate. You see, Mrs. Clarissa, I have spent a considerable portion of my life examining the relationships between people, studying the ways in which long-accumulated resentments, humiliations, and compromises transform themselves into acts of violence. And I perceive in your history with your brother-in-law something far more corrosive than simple financial anxiety. I perceive a woman who has spent decades in service to a man whose contempt for propriety was matched only by his insistence that she maintain it on his behalf. I perceive a woman who sacrificed her own opportunities for marriage and independence to manage a household built upon deception. I perceive a woman who watched her sister endure the humiliation of acknowledged infidelity, who was forced to participate in the conspiracy of silence that protected Edmund's reputation, and who has been compensated for this complicity by gradually diminishing security and relevance. Whimsy rose from his chair and moved toward the window, gazing out upon the grounds with the expression of a man contemplating abstract philosophy. The letter from Edmund's daughter was merely the final provocation, the ultimate demonstration that the pattern of his life would continue, that his indulgence would persist, and that those of us who have sacrificed our own lives to maintain his comfort would be sacrificed in turn to accommodate his latest whim. Is that a fair assessment, Mrs. Clarissa? The silence that followed extended long enough to constitute its own form of answer. When Clarissa finally spoke, her voice had lost the carefully maintained quality of controlled confession and emerged instead in the raw tones of genuine emotion. I have given him 40 years, she said, the words emerging Ost without her volition. 40 years of managing his household, maintaining his reputation, accepting his humiliations, and asking for nothing in return save basic security. And in the end, he would have discarded me without compunction to acknowledge a daughter he never bothered to marry, to fund a life he had deemed unsuitable for public acknowledgement. I was disposable, Lord Peter, and I found I could not accept that final indignity. Whimsy turned from the window to regard her directly, and his expression, while sympathetic, remained implacable. No, he said quietly, you could not accept it. And so you chose murder. A comprehensible choice, perhaps even a sympathetic one to those inclined toward psychological understanding. Yet it remains, nonetheless, murder, and it must therefore be treated as such. The matter of Colonel Edmund Ashford's death proceeded through the machinery of English justice with the ponderous inevitability of a mechanism that, while slow, possessed considerable efficiency once properly engaged. The local magistrate, upon examination of the evidence and the confession, determined that the case possessed sufficient substance to warrant formal charges. Clarissa was remanded into custody, awaiting trial at the assizes, a development that transformed the quiet scandal of Ashford Manor into the subject of considerable gossip throughout the village and beyond. The newspapers, having acquired wind of the situation through channels that Whimsy suspected involved at least one constable with a pressing need for supplementary income, began to construct their own narratives, each version more sensational than its predecessor. Yet it was not the legal machinery alone that occupied Whimsy's attention during the week following Clarissa's arrest. Rather, it was the matter of the Colonel's illegitimate daughter, the woman named Meredith Colborne, who had, through her letter demanding acknowledgement and financial settlement, inadvertently precipitated the events that culminated in her father's death. Whimsy found himself wrestling with the uncomfortable implications of what had transpired. The girl, for she was in retrospect rather more girl than woman despite her years, had committed no crime. She had merely requested what she believed to be her due, unaware that her demand would result not in a financial settlement, but in her father's murder and the imprisonment of a woman whose primary crime had been insufficient resilience in the face of cumulative indignity. It was this consideration that prompted Whimsy to undertake a journey to London on the morning following Clarissa's formal charges. The address provided in the Colonel's personal correspondence, Correspondence that Stephen had eventually located in a locked box beneath the floorboards of his uncle's study indicated that Meredith Colborne maintained lodgings in a respectable though unpretentious quarter of Kensington. The building itself was the sort of Victorian terrace house that had been subdivided into apartments, each occupant maintaining the fiction of privacy while aware that the walls permitted the passage of considerably more sound than discretion would ideally allow. Meredith herself answered the door on the second knock, a young woman of perhaps 30 years whose appearance suggested a careful management of limited resources. Her features bore sufficient resemblance to the Colonel to indicate paternity. Beyond any reasonable doubt, though, she possessed none of her father's imperious bearing. Instead, she carried herself with the slightly defensive posture of one accustomed to being perceived as an irregularity in the social fabric, an embarrassment to be acknowledged only in the strictest privacy. Lord Peter Wimsey, he introduced himself, employing T. a manner that had proven effective in extracting cooperation from those initially inclined toward suspicion. "I wonder whether you might spare me a quarter hour. It concerns your father, Colonel Ashford, and the circumstances surrounding his recent death." The color drained from Meredith's face with the rapidity of water from a broken vessel. "He is dead?" she asked, though her voice suggested that some part of her had already perceived the truth. "The letter, did something happen because of the letter?" Wimsey requested permission to enter, and presently found himself in a modest sitting room furnished with the sort of items that suggested a woman of taste but limited financial capacity. Meredith prepared tea with mechanical precision, her hands trembling slightly as she measured and poured, and when she had settled herself opposite him, she possessed the appearance of a woman bracing for news of considerable import. "Your father died approximately 10 days ago," Wimsey began, selecting each word with characteristic care. The official cause was determined to be cardiac failure. However, subsequent investigation has revealed that he was in fact poisoned by his sister-in-law, Mrs. Clarissa Ashford, who administered cyanide through the medium of a tonic he consumed regularly. Your letter, which arrived shortly before his death, precipitated this action by causing Mrs. Clarissa to perceive her own future security as threatened. Meredith's reaction was not what Wimsey had anticipated. Rather than expressing shock or guilt or the various emotions that might have been reasonably expected, she merely nodded slowly, as though receiving confirmation of something she had long suspected but never quite dared to articulate. "I did not know him," she said quietly. "He visited occasionally when I was a child, bringing gifts and displaying the sort of paternal affection that one might expect from a man visiting his mistress's daughter rather than his own child. But there was always a distance, a sense that his genuine life existed elsewhere, that I represented merely an inconvenient complication to be managed rather than a person to be truly acknowledged. My mother maintained the illusion that he would eventually leave his wife, that we would somehow be legitimized and integrated into his proper family. But I perceived, even as a child, that such legitimization would never occur, that my existence would always be contingent upon his willingness to maintain the arrangement." She paused, taking a sip of tea that she did not appear to taste. "When my husband died, when I found myself in financial distress without resources to address it, I wrote to my father. I demanded that he acknowledge me, that he provide some material compensation for years of existence as an unacknowledged complication. I was angry, Lord Peter, angry at his hypocrisy, angry at his willingness to profit from respectability while maintaining a parallel life, angry at my own weakness in allowing myself to believe that the situation was somehow temporary. But I did not write to him with any desire that harm should befall him. I merely wanted recognition. I wanted acknowledgement that I existed, that my suffering was real, that my existence was not merely some embarrassing detail to be concealed and managed." Wimsey regarded her with the compassion of a man who had long since ceased to expect the universe to arrange itself according to principles of justice or proportion. "Your father's death is not your responsibility," he said quietly. "The woman who administered the poison made a deliberate choice to do so. She was motivated by her own financial anxieties and years of accumulated resentment. You are merely the occasion of her crime, not its cause. There is a distinctio." though I suspect it may provide little comfort." "Will she be executed?" Meredith asked, the question emerging barely above a whisper. Whimsy considered the matter with the gravity it deserved. "That will depend upon various factors: the sympathy of the judge, the persuasiveness of counsel, the particular jury assembled to determine her fate. English justice is not always as neat as one might wish. But murder remains murder, and the law must proceed accordingly." The trial of Clarissa Ashford proceeded through the autumn season and into the early winter with the methodical solemnity that English justice reserves for cases involving murder within the domestic sphere. The courtroom was packed with spectators, drawn by the dual attractions of scandal and the morbid fascination that attends the fall of someone who had previously occupied a respectable position within society. The prosecution presented its case with competent efficiency, laying out the facts with the precision of a barrister who had long since ceased to be surprised by the capacity for violence that ordinary people could demonstrate when sufficiently motivated. The poison, the timing, the careful removal of evidence, the destruction of correspondence, all of it was presented with meticulous attention to detail that left little room for reasonable doubt. Whimsy, having been subpoenaed as a witness to provide expert testimony regarding the investigation's progress, found himself occupying the witness box on a grey November afternoon, providing precise and detailed answers to questions posed by counsel for both the prosecution and the defense. The defense counsel, a man named Hartwick with considerable experience in cases involving domestic tragedy, attempted through a series of carefully constructed questions to establish reasonable doubt regarding Clarissa's premeditation, to suggest that the crime represented a momentary loss of composure rather than calculated murder. Yet Whimsy, with characteristic precision, systematically dismantled each attempt at mitigation, explaining with patient clarity how the retention of the poison, the gradual introduction of the tonic, and the careful destruction of evidence all pointed toward deliberate intention rather than impulsive act. It was during cross-examination that Hartwick made his most significant attempt to introduce an element of sympathetic interpretation into the proceedings. He posed, with calculated gentleness, a question regarding Whimsy's perception of Mrs. Clarissa's psychological state and the cumulative effects of decades spent in service to a man whose conduct had been, by any reasonable standard, contemptible. Whimsy, caught momentarily between his obligation to provide factual testimony and his own perception of the situation's moral complexity, found himself forced to acknowledge that while such factors might serve to explain Clarissa's actions from a psychological perspective, they did not serve to excuse them from a legal one. The law, Whimsy stated carefully, does not provide mitigation for crimes committed in response to injustice or indignity, however genuine those injustices might be. To do so would render murder a permissible response to any number of personal grievances, from infidelity to professional disappointment to simple financial hardship. Mrs. Clarissa Ashford possessed options that did not involve the administration of poison. She could have sought legal counsel regarding her financial security, could have attempted reconciliation with her brother-in-law regarding her future circumstances, or could have removed herself from a situation that she found intolerable. Instead, she chose deliberate murder. The sympathetic elements of her situation do not alter the fundamental nature of that choice. The jury, composed primarily of men of property and standing, appeared unmoved by the defense's attempts to introduce elements of sympathy into their considerations. After deliberating for slightly less than 3 hours, a duration that suggested neither significant doubt nor exceptional conviction, but rather the sort of middle ground that characterized juries attempting to balance conflicting impulses, they returned with a verdict of guilty. The judge, an elderly man named Ashcroft with a reputation for severity tempered by an occasional capacity for mercy, donned the black cap and proceeded to pronounce sentence with the ceremonial gravity that accompanied such pronouncements. Death by hanging, to be carried out on a date to be determined by the Home Office. The sentence was delivered without apparent emotion, though Whimsy detected in the judge's bearing a certain weariness, as though he had been obliged to perform this particular function too many times, and had long since ceased to derive any satisfaction from the exercise of his authority. Clarissa received the sentence without visible reaction. She stood in the dock with the same resigned composure that had characterized her confession, as though she had accepted not merely the legal consequences of her actions, but had embraced them as the appropriate conclusion to a life that had become insupportable. As she was removed from the courtroom, she turned her gaze briefly toward Whimsy, and in that moment of connection, he perceived something resembling gratitude, not for her conviction, but for the simple fact that her secret, the accumulated weight of decades spent in service to a man who had treated her with casual contempt, had finally been acknowledged and made manifest before witnesses. Whimsy departed the courtroom with Bunter in attendance, the valet's customary impassivity, providing a welcome contrast to the emotional turbulence that had characterized the morning's proceedings. As they made their way toward the waiting motor car, Stephen Ashford emerged from the crowd of spectators, his expression betraying the complex mixture of emotions that characterized a man attempting to reconcile familial loyalty with the requirements of justice. "I wished to thank you," Stephen said, falling into step beside Whimsy, "for your thoroughness in investigating my uncle's death. I confess that when I first wrote to the Home Office, I possessed only suspicions. But your investigation transformed those suspicions into irrefutable fact. My uncle's reputation is certainly damaged, but at least the truth is now known, and my family need not labor under the uncertainty of not understanding precisely what occurred. The truth," Whimsy replied with characteristic irony, "is perhaps not always as satisfying as one might wish. Your uncle maintained a second family, while your great-aunt sacrificed her own life to maintain a fiction of respectability. The truth, now revealed, is that both of them were fundamentally selfish individuals, though Clarissa's selfishness at least possessed the virtue of honesty once it had been exposed. But you are correct that resolution O.F. sorts has been achieved. The machinery of justice has proceeded, conclusions have been drawn, and life must now continue as it does in the aftermath of all significant disturbances. The matter of Colonel Edmund Ashford's estate proceeded through legal channels with the sort of methodical efficiency that characterized the disposition of deceased persons' affairs within the English system. Stephen, as the primary heir following his uncle's death, found himself in possession of considerable property and financial resources, though the inheritance carried with it the uncomfortable knowledge that it had been secured through murder. The question of Meredith Colborne's position within this arrangement proved more complex. The colonel had, despite his unwillingness to acknowledge her publicly during his lifetime, made provision for her in his will, a provision that suggested he had possessed at least some awareness of moral obligation, however inadequately expressed. Stephen, demonstrating a generosity that Whimsy suspected derived more from guilt than from genuine magnanimity, chose not to contest the bequest, and Meredith received a sum sufficient to ensure her financial security for the remainder of her years. It was this resolution that prompted Whimsy to undertake a final visit to London some 3 months following Clarissa's conviction. The season had shifted from autumn into the brittle clarity of winter, and the city presented itself in that particular state of grey austerity that characterized English capitals in December. Meredith received him in rooms considerably more comfortable than those he had visited previously, the improved circumstances evident in furniture of superior quality and appointments, suggesting a woman no longer constrained by financial desperation. She had written to him requesting this meeting, and Whimsy possessing that particular curiosity regarding the aftermath of murder investigations that characterized his approach to such matters, had accepted with his customary grace. "I have been thinking," Meredith said, settling herself across from him in a drawing-room warmed by an excellent fire, "about the nature of responsibility and the distinction between intention and consequence. My letter to my father precipitated the events that led to his death. Had I not written, had I accepted my status as an unacknowledged complication rather than demanding recognition, Mrs. Clarissa would not have committed murder. Does that make me, in some sense, responsible for her crime?" Whimsy considered the question with the gravity it deserved, recognizing it as a manifestation of that particular form of guilt that attends those who have become entangled, however innocently, in the consequences of others' actions. "The question you pose is one that philosophers have wrestled with since time immemorial," he replied with characteristic precision. "One might argue that every action ripples outward through existence, that we are all responsible for consequences we could not have anticipated. Yet such a philosophy would render us all guilty of crimes we never committed, victims of circumstances beyond our control or perception. The law, in its imperfect wisdom, has determined that responsibility attaches to the person who commits the act, not to those who inadvertently provide the occasion for that act. Mrs. Clarissa made a deliberate choice to murder your father. That choice was hers alone. Your letter merely provided the final precipitating circumstance that transformed her decades of accumulated resentment into action. And yet," Meredith persisted, "I cannot escape the sense that I bear some portion of responsibility. My father maintained an arrangement that was fundamentally dishonorable. Mrs. Clarissa enabled and perpetuated that arrangement through her own silence and acquiescence. And I, in demanding recognition of a situation that both of them had conspired to conceal, provoked the catastrophe that has ensued. We are all guilty, Lord Peter. Not legally, perhaps, but morally. We all conspired, through various forms of action and inaction, to create the conditions that resulted in a man's death." Whimsy set down his teacup with deliberate care, regarding her with an expression that suggested he perceived in her words a dangerous tendency toward the sort of excessive moral scrupulosity that could render life itself unbearable. "You are, I suspect, a woman of considerable conscience," he observed, "which is precisely why I must counsel you against the temptation to assume responsibility for the actions of others. The world is sufficiently weighted with guilt and consequence without our adding to that burden through acceptance of blame for circumstances beyond our control. Your father was a man who maintained an elaborate fiction to preserve his reputation and comfort. Mrs. Clarissa was a woman who sacrificed her own autonomy to enable that fiction. You were merely a person whose existence represented an inconvenient complication to their carefully constructed arrangement. That you demanded acknowledgement was not unreasonable. That your demand precipitated murder was not your moral failing, but rather the inevitable consequence of a system built upon hypocrisy and contempt for those deemed expendable." He rose from his chair with the fluid grace that had characterized his movements throughout the investigation, moving toward the window to gaze out upon the London streets with their characteristic mixture of commerce and purposeful movement. "Mrs. Clarissa will be executed in 3 weeks' time. The Home Office has determined that her case does not warrant the exercise of clemency, that the crime was sufficiently deliberate and calculated as to preclude mitigation. She has, I am informed, accepted this sentence with equanimity, suggesting that she perceived in the legal consequence of her actions a form of release from circumstances that had become intolerable. One might say that she obtained, through the machinery of English justice, the liberation that her own life had denied her. It is a grim consolation, but a consolation nonetheless." "Is there nothing we can do?" Meredith asked quietly. "Some appeal, some petition that might alter her fate?" "No," Whimsy replied with characteristic directness, "and I would counsel against such an attempt. Mrs. Clarissa committed murder. The law has determined the appropriate consequence. To attempt to subvert that consequence, however sympathetic the motivation, would be to suggest that murder is permissible when motivated by sufficient grievance. I will not advocate for the subversion of justice, however imperfect that justice might be. The machinery of law must proceed, and those who have set it in motion must accept the consequences that flow from their actions." He turned from the window to regard her directly, his expression carrying that particular blend of sympathy and ironic detachment that had characterized his investigation throughout its entirety. "You have your security now, Miss Colborne. You have received acknowledgement, albeit posthumous, of your existence. I would suggest that you endeavor to construct a life for yourself that is defined not by the circumstances of your birth or the tragedy that has attended your efforts to gain recognition, but rather by your own deliberate choices. That is the only genuine liberation available to any of us, the freedom to determine our own path, regardless of the circumstances from which we emerged, as Whimsy departed her rooms into the grey December afternoon. He carried with him the sense of a case concluded, its various complications resolved into the sort of imperfect justice that characterized most human affairs. The evening coat hook that had first provoked his suspicion had long since been returned to its hook, the study at Ashford Manor had resumed its normal appearance, and the world had moved on to other scandals and other mysteries. Yet somewhere in the depths of his consciousness, Whimsy retained the image of Clarissa's face in that final moment before her removal from the courtroom. Not the face of a murderer, but rather the face of a woman who had finally achieved, through the medium of confession and condemnation, the acknowledgement of her own existence that life had consistently denied her.